We generally know that fathers don't get as good a deal in family court, and we don't really complain about it until it happens to us. And even then, a lot of men don't.
Many men's rights activists come into being men's rights activists as a result of getting a divorce, wanting to be equally involved with the children, and realizing that women have the right to children and men have to fight for children.
When your family courts run on the supposition that mothers are more fit to be custodial parents and that fathers are more fit to provide a check every month and to become what we like to call Uncle Daddy, where they visit their children. To me, that's one of the greatest obscenities in the world, the idea of visiting your own children, where you get to see them for 2 hours on Wednesday night, and you get to have them for X amount of hours every other weekend, and you have no say in how they're brought up.
You know, I can't tell you how many men have been in this office, in that chair, in tears because they can't see their kids.
And some of this stuff ends up in horrific consequences. Like this gentleman here, it's his little son. They found him dead. Not the son, but the young man. In the desert with a bullet in his head. Day before the family court, where it became known that he was going to get to see his little guy even less. And of course, he'd been falsely accused one time after another. It had destroyed his life. It had bankrupted him. It had driven him into debt. It had caused him to miss work. He was about ready to lose his job. He was in the end of his rope, so he just decided to end it.
The unfairness in the family courts, the unfairness in the way child support is so often structured, it's commonplace and it's everywhere. And the more you start to become conscious of it, the more you realize that it's there.
I started to research some fathers' rights issues and came across some harrowing stories. Like this man in South Carolina who found out his only daughter was adopted away by the mother without his knowledge or consent.
His daughter was with an adoptive family in California, so he began his fight to get his daughter back.
Adoption is for children without families, not children with a willing and capable family.
And this man in Colorado who lost his daughter when the mother left the state to give birth in Utah, where he wouldn't have legal rights to his child. He fought for 4 years in court and finally won visitation rights. Only visitation.
I can't explain the emotion, the happiness. There's this hard fight and what this means to me.
And then there's this heartbreaking story.
The 20-year-old father never left her side until he was forced to give her to adoptive parents this week after Kaylee's mother decided to put her up for adoption. In order to keep Kaylee, Colby needed to file paternity action, an affidavit, and a commencement notice with Utah's Vital Records a day before the mother signed the adoption papers relinquishing her rights. But in Colby's case, the mother only gave him a few hours' notice of what she was going to do.
I would like her back. Men in the men's movement are not upset about having to be fathers. They're upset because they're not allowed to be fathers.
That guy blows his head out, blows his brains out because of family court? And people don't think there's something wrong with that? And we just open the doors tomorrow for business as usual, and that's okay?
I've always thought of feminism as being the fight for gender equality. And yet, I've never heard about fathers' rights and the injustices going on in family court. Why is this? I decided to ask gender studies professor Michael Mesner.
Well, I'll just say I don't think it's, I don't think that a lot of their assumptions are correct to start with. There's no doubt that there have been some men who get just screwed by court decisions and custody cases. But I think when you look at the broader patterns, it's still the case that in intact heterosexual families with kids, women are still doing the vast majority of the housework and childcare, and there's a lot of sort of father absence, lack of participation by fathers, some of whom I think then after divorce happens end up suddenly wanting equality, as fathers when they haven't really been participating equally as fathers before. So to me, it always kind of swings back to the feminist perspective of how we need to push for full equality across the board, including before divorces. If we have that, then we might expect more symmetry after divorces happening.
The more I researched fathers' rights, the more I realized how deep this rabbit hole goes. Not only in the amount of issues, but also in the vast array of perspectives on these issues. I decided to create a flowchart of what I thought fathers' options might be following a surprise pregnancy. I then put a green line for the paths that I thought would be good turnouts for the father, and I put red lines for the paths that seemed to not be good for the father. Then I created a flowchart for women's options, and did the same with green and red lines. And as I stepped back, I saw all the red lines for the women's options if she does not want the child. But something dawned on me. Of every path the biological father could go down, he's at the mercy of the woman's sole discretion. Although women have very difficult choices to make, she at least has the choice. But for biological fathers, they have no say over their parental destiny. This is my friend Dara. She's 8 months pregnant with her first child, and she's a lifelong feminist.
It seems from MRIs, from what I've read, that women seem to have more reproductive rights than men do. I don't know what to say, like, we carry children, they're never gonna carry children. It's just a different thing. So I guess, as much as possible, take the steps to prevent yourself being in that situation. It's just, I don't know what to say. There's no, there's nothing like a woman, women have been blamed for, and still are, for, unwanted pregnancies, choosing to have an abortion, not choosing to have an abortion, choosing to put their child up for adoption, when, the burden lies on a single mother. If the man leaves, there's real, societally, she's lambasted. So there's a lot of things that women deal with in that regard that men don't actually deal with. So I can have compassion for their situation, but I don't know that it's gonna change in the way they want it to, because it's biology,
So if you're going to be having sex that could result in pregnancy, and you haven't had this conversation with the woman that you're having sex with, you better have it. You better have it fast. That's when the man has the ability to make decisions, either not to engage in sex or to use condoms and to use other forms of contraception. So that's where his role comes in. Once he's impregnated her, she's the one now faced with continuing a pregnancy, faced with the health risks that accompany pregnancy. So his rights have to be exercised early, but once she's pregnant, all decisions must be hers, because ultimately she is the most impacted. There's just no question, and she ultimately has the responsibility for that child.
So So before we were married, he promised me we would have 2 kids, and now he doesn't want any more. My friends think I should trick him and stop taking my birth control.
Men have never been in control of our bodies. We're the ones in control. Clap if you think that she should trick him. My people. Up next, everybody.
So it sounds like men's reproductive rights are limited to the choice of whether or not to have sex and the choice of whether or not to use protection. But what if he's tricked into fatherhood? Or what if he's not even the father?
What does paternity fraud look like?
It's ugly. It's extraordinarily ugly. And we have to distinguish between paternity fraud and wrongful paternity.
What's the difference?
Wrongful paternity can be innocent. Okay, we went to a party. I had sex with 6 guys. I think it was when I was hanging out the window I got pregnant, but I wasn't sure. But, you know, if anybody knows that guy's name, would you please have him call me? And then she names one of the other guys, and he didn't have sex with her. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't intentional. She wasn't trying to harm anybody. She was just trying to figure out who it was. Wrongful paternity. More often, and less facetiously, okay, I'm married, I had an affair. Obviously here, there's all sorts of problems because there are more victims than the person who's named as dear old dad, who may be the wrong one. There's everybody involved in the family, like a situation in Texas, where the family had 5 little towhead kids, all guys, all little blondos. And all of a sudden, one day, one of the little blondo kids gets in trouble, has to go to the hospital. They can't get a hold of mom. They get a hold of dad. Dad rushes to the hospital, needs to give blood. Whoops. Can't do it. Wrong blood. What? All the kids look alike. Turns out it was the guy down the street.
You've heard of this case?
No, it's a real case. So what happens to this family? Can you fathom what happens to this family? How do you think the kids feel when they find out dear old dad isn't dear old dad and it's the guy down the street? How do you think dad feels? That these 5 little boys that he still loves dearly, when he finds out they're not his bio children, but he still can't tear away because he loves them. He's devoted himself to these. How do you think he feels? I mean, it's horrific. Horrific. That's not wrongful, that's deliberate.
So that's paternity fraud.
That's paternity fraud.
She knew who the father was and lied about it.
Paul was right when he said, trying to understand the men's rights movement is like trying to understand a snowdrift, one snowflake at a time. There are unique fathers' rights issues that vary between unmarried, married, and divorced dads. But there are also men's rights issues for non-biological fathers. Like this man who is facing jail time for failure to pay child support for a child that DNA tests prove isn't his.
Carnell Alexander still owes more than $30,000 to the state for a child that's not his because the mom wrote his name down because she needed to name someone in order to get welfare benefits.
And I had to put him down as the father. That was the only way I can get the system.
I'm almost homeless. I'm almost in jail. I'm out of work. My money is being threatened to be taken.
He says the law needs to be changed, so when this happens, as it often does, other men don't become dad by default.
A lot of times people wonder about MRIs, why are you guys so angry? And my answer to that is, why aren't you? How can anybody look at this and not be angered by it? And the only answer to that I've ever been able to come up with is that people aren't angry because they don't see men as human beings.
I continued traveling North America, meeting MRAs from all walks of life, hearing their personal stories, their red pill moments, I met a young man who was sexually abused when he was 16 years old while living at a residential home for people with developmental disabilities.
She's the only woman I've done anything ever with, partly because it just messed me up so much.
She continues working there.
She hit me in the face. She actually hit me throughout the house, chasing me throughout the house. When I reported my domestic assault to the police officers, I did not at all bring up the fact that I was sexually assaulted, because if he wasn't going to believe that I was a victim of domestic violence, there was no way he was going to believe that I was going to be a victim of sexual assault.
I met the honey badgers, women who are men's rights advocates.
And then there was a 15-year-old boy, there was a 35-year-old woman, and then later on she came out of jail and she was able to collect child support from this boy that she raped.
Yeah.
After getting out of jail. So there's lack of fairness for men in the court systems. When police officers would show up to domestic violence case, there was often men were just taken away without asking what even happened. It's just presumed that men are the criminals.
I was assaulted several times, and I never got any help. I went to the police still bleeding a couple of times. And one police officer said, I'll never forget this. He said, if she starts hitting you again, you better get out of there fast, because if she just breaks a fingernail trying to hit you, we'll arrest you.
I mean, I can't tell you at this point how many guys I've talked to who are like, yeah, she stabbed me and they put me in jail. Not only are there endless studies that show women are just as violent as men are, when I would talk about it, invariably, men would start coming out of the woodwork with stories. Stories they were afraid to tell, stories that they got laughed at for, stories that they got blamed for. It's hideous.
This is not flattering to men, to talk about men's vulnerabilities.
No.
To talk about the ways that they are not strong and that they are, weak. And to be honest about it, it's not flattering. A solution for both genders is that we need to be able to recognize how men are vulnerable, and we need to be able to recognize how women are actors. Because we have a huge blind spot, especially when women do bad things.
My best friend that I grew up with since kindergarten was being physically abused by his wife, who he'd been married to for 20 years. She'll break glass and throw it at him, punch him. I've seen it just happen spontaneously, and it was frequent. And he's bigger than her, but he didn't want to hit her. And he didn't want the children, they had 3 minor children, he didn't want them seeing this at all. So he would usually just go outside, because there would be glass breaking or things being smashed or yelling, and he knew that the neighbors might think it's him. So he would go outside so the neighbors can see what's happening. Eventually I said, look, you need professional help, and so does she, and maybe the kids do too. So I called a bunch of domestic violence shelters. I just looked around online and I called, but every place that I called said, we don't help men. We don't help male men at all. And I started becoming curious about why that was, because I learned that these were state-funded shelters. And I know that men pay at least half of the taxes that fund these shelters if they're state-funded, and I just was wondering why. So basically, there was no place to take him, and it just continued. The problem just kept going.
In the United States, there are over 2,000 domestic violence shelters. All of them serve female victims, and nearly all of them turn away male victims. In fact, as of 2016, there's only a single domestic violence shelter for men. My initial reaction was that there needed to be thousands more women's shelters because that many more women are being battered. But as it turns out, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will be victims of physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. Sure, there's a slight majority of female victims, but how can that excuse denying men help? Couldn't this be considered gender discrimination? Think of it this way. Roughly 78% of all suicides are men. If suicide prevention services only served men, wouldn't we see the gender discrimination immediately? If there are over 2,000 women's shelters that turn away men, and only 1 shelter for men, obviously the resources don't match the need.
How are you involved in the men's rights movement?
Well, from the very beginning, when I first opened the Refuge, which was in 1971 in Chiswick in London, almost as soon as I took the women in, I got a house for men.
A Voice for Men's editor-at-large, Erin Pizzey, founded the first ever women's shelter in 1971, and she is widely revered in the men's rights community.
Because you see, what I knew from the beginning, most domestic violence is consensual. Both are involved. Sometimes one's the perpetrator, the other plays the victim, then it crosses over. It's not as though it's just all men or all women. It's both, and occasionally innocent victims, very innocent.
Battered children grow up to batter, that's what I learned. Whether it be a man or a woman. And I now know that if a woman comes in with a history of violence in her own childhood, the chances are she will be probably violent to her children, and she will want to live on this knife edge of crisis and danger.
I haven't been allowed to speak, that's the difficulty.
Why is that?
Because I'm completely barred from all conferences. I'm not allowed to walk up the step of my own refuge. I bought the bloody building. But no, because there's feminists, the woman who runs it is a very heavy feminist. She won't have anything to do with me.
What did you say that made them hate you?
That women could be equally as violent as men. That was from the beginning.
Erin Pizzey says that 62 of the first 100 women to enter her refuge were just as violent as the men they left, and violent towards their children.
But there's levels of violence, isn't there?
I do not affect that I'm violent.
Well, I'm violent.
So am I.
You know, I'm very violent. Whereas verbally, I could quite easily hit somebody. You know, very, very easily. And I've had an argument.
But the feminists I've met have an entirely different take on domestic violence.
On the whole issue of domestic violence, that's just another word, really. It's a cleanup word about wife beating, because that's really what it is, or dating violence. And it's not girls that are beating up on boys, it's boys that are beating up on girls and using violence to intimidate and to control. And we have very few what's called domestic violence shelters, which are places that women can leave their home with their children and get a new start, get out of the violence. But there are not nearly enough of them. We need more funding and more resources, because it is a tremendous disadvantage for women and girls.
In 2014, the CDC released a report revealing that over 5.4 million men and 4.7 million women had been victims of intimate partner physical violence within the previous 12 months. But then why does the media paint domestic violence as a women's issue?
The World Health Organization says 1 in 3 women are abused by their partner.
1 in 3 American women experiences domestic violence or stalking at some point in her life.
And when it was addressed as a men's issue, the speaker's point was that it's a men's issue because men are the problem.
I'm going to share with you a paradigm-shifting perspective on the issues of gender violence. I don't see these as women's issues that some good men help out with. In fact, I'm going to argue that these are men's issues. Why is domestic violence still a big problem in the United States and all over the world? What's going on? Why do so many men abuse physically, emotionally, and verbally and other ways the women and girls and the men and boys that they claim to love? What's going on with men?
Let's grant every single empirical case as being true. Yes, it is true. Let's just say, I mean, it is not true, but let's just assume that there is gender symmetry in domestic violence, that women hit men as much as men hit women. If I were to say that, I would say, and therefore we need boatloads more funding for domestic violence to develop shelters and adequate interventions, because there's this hidden epidemic of men who are being beaten up by women. Or I could say, as the men's rights movement do, therefore we shouldn't have these shelters and we shouldn't fund them because the women are all lying. Well, it seems to me that if you really believe in gender symmetry, it's not that you want to, you're not questioning the number of women. You're just saying the number of men is high. You would want to join with women who are anti-violence to say, we have a real problem here. You know, it's not even a gender problem. It's a problem of women hitting men and men hitting women. We've got to get boatloads more funding. Let's work together. That seems the logical response to this. But instead they're saying it's like a zero-sum game. If we fund the women, then we're going to ignore the men. Well, we're not going to ignore the women because we all agree that the levels are as high as we say.
But it does sound like a zero-sum game when only women are receiving services in domestic violence situations. And of all the men's rights activists I've met, none of them question the number of female victims, but they are calling attention to the high number of male victims that are being dismissed. So why aren't men's rights activists and feminists working together? Michael Kimmel briefly said something that made me wonder. He said it would no longer be a gender problem if both men and women were equally victims of domestic violence. Is that why the number of male victims are never addressed?
To me, it's been fraud for all these years. Why is it we have this enormously powerful feminist movement and virtually nothing for men? Originally, it was capitalism was the big enemy in the 60s and 70s. And it was the radical feminists in America. They moved the goalposts. They said, no, it's no longer capitalism is the enemy. The enemy is patriarchy, or men. And that's how the women's movement began. And it was enormously successful. The new mood in the refuges was going to be that no men could work in refuges and can't today. They can't sit on the boards. And boys over 9 or possibly 12 can't go into refuges, or you call them shelters. Their mothers have to make other arrangements for them, which I find shocking. And it ring-fenced money. I think that that particular time when the feminist movement were desperate for funding because they'd run out of publicity, and they were desperate for funding and they needed a just cause. And unfortunately, it fell into their laps. It's an enormous industry. I mean, violence against women, they get something like, well, it's $1 billion and over a year. And an awful lot of that goes on really supposedly rehabilitating men, but essentially punishing them with something that's called the Duluth model.
Duluth Power and Control Wheel. You guys know about that?
No.
I'll give you a copy. In 1977, I think, a bunch of crazy women up in Duluth, Minnesota figured out they had the solution to domestic violence, and it was all about patriarchy and all about men. And it's the Duluth Power and Control Wheel, because men are all about power and control. Of course, not you ladies. You guys, you don't control anything. You have no power. You're just sweet and innocent little things. Okay. So when this power and control wheel is divided up in all these things, you know, about who does this and who does that and blah, blah, blah. Of course, it's all men. The entire domestic violence industry was founded on that. I think it's still 37 or 32 states in the United States that by law they have to use the Duluth model for battery intervention programs, and it's all shame, blame, and guilt driven. If you're a man and you walk in, you must admit you did it up front or you're in denial. There's no debate, there's no discussion, there's no possibility that you could be falsely accused. The criminal justice system could have made a mistake. None whatsoever. You are in a state of denial, and you will complete that course or you're going to go to jail. You will be re-engineered.
It's frightening.
Frightening?
Yes, that's frightening.
I think it's terrifying. Absolutely terrifying.
All I had to do, I had a simple choice. I could just say, yes, you're right. Men are the enemy. No problem. But I couldn't. I absolutely couldn't.
Just getting overwhelmed. Because I don't know where I'm headed with what I believe and what is right and what is wrong and who is wrong and who is right, and the truth is somewhere in the middle, and that's why I'm feeling frustrated, because I don't know where the truth is, and I don't know
When I decided to make a film on the men's rights movement, I never anticipated questioning my feminist views. But the more MRAs I met, the more I felt compelled to remind myself why I was a feminist. I signed up for a women's group.
Welcome to our Women on Your Power workshop. Only 4% of the Fortune 500 companies are led by women. Women only hold about 14% of corporate executive positions and less than 20% of our governmental positions.
I made video diaries complaining about how I had to change what I wore to walk alone at night, how much time it took me to get ready for work, all the housekeeping that was on my shoulders. In comparison to other gender issues, these videos seem trivial, but I made them nonetheless. I attended women's rights rallies.
No to violence. That's what we are here for, to say no more to violence in any forms, especially against women and girls.
I repeated women's issues in my head like a broken record. Female genital mutilation, sex trafficking, reproductive rights, maternity leave. And social media helped remind me of women's issues.
We have fought for everybody else's equal rights. It's our time to have wage equality once and for all, and equal rights for women in the United States of America.
We are struggling for a uniting word, but the good news is that we have a uniting movement. It is called He for She.
Whenever I hear the MRA's point of view about how difficult it is for them, I immediately go to, well, what about us? What is it like for us? And then I get on the defensive and want to make sure that women's struggles are also heard. And I don't know if that's necessary, because the MRAs are saying that the feminist perspective is the mainstream perspective. But even when I hear their issues, I still want to speak up for the women, because I feel like, I don't know why I feel like talking about one gender's issues now neglects the other. And I guess that's what MRAs have been dealing with, is always hearing about women's issues and feeling like their issues are neglected. But whenever I hear them talk about men's issues, I feel like I need to stand up for women and say, this is what we're dealing with, an equal opposite.
I met with men's rights activist Karen Strawn late one night in a noisy bar. She became well known for her YouTube videos talking about male disposability and other men's rights issues. And she's a honey badger.
Part of what I do and what I research and what I think about is the reason psychologically why feminism seems to be such a comfortable, warm blanket emotionally for so many people, men and women alike. And it's so comfortable that it will make them not see things that are right in front of their face. Look at Boko Haram.
Hundreds of young girls, fast asleep in their beds, are awakened by the sound of gunfire. Armed attackers have stormed their boarding school and set fire to dozens of buildings. Nearly 300 of them are dragged from their dorm, loaded onto trucks, and carried away deep into the forest.
From New York to London rallied yesterday demanding that the terrorist group Boko Haram bring back our girls. It just gets to the core of you,
This unconscionable act was committed by a terrorist group determined to keep these girls from getting an education. And what happened in Nigeria was not an isolated incident. It is a story we see every day as girls around the world risk their lives to pursue their ambitions.
I mean, you must have heard about that, right? That's being spun as a fundamentalist Islamic group that is so determined to be misogynistic and oppress girls that they want to deny girls an education. But they are not against girls being educated. They're against anybody getting a Western secular or Christian education. The initial attacks, and there were several of them, there were over 100 men killed and 1 woman killed. And the victims were described as people, right, or villagers. And in the previous attacks on the schools, they actually let the girls go. They separated out the boys and girls, and they let the girls go, and they told them, go home, get married, renounce your sins, and live a righteous life under Allah, right? And then they burned the boys alive. There was literally no outrage, right? It was barely reported on. It was one of those things, there was no opinion pieces on it, no nothing, right? Until the girls were kidnapped. And look at it this way, because we played right into their hands, because they want attention, right? And they weren't getting any attention from the Western media when they were just slaughtering boys, right? They want attention. And what do? They kidnap girls and sell them into marriage or slavery, right? And everybody, the UN, Michelle Obama, Barack Obama, the UK government, the Canadian Federal Minister of Defense, right? They're all promising aid and help and equipment and personnel to help find these girls and bring them back, because this is such an outrage and oh my goodness, something needs to be done. Well, maybe if, like last year, maybe if we did something then, all of these girls would be safe in their dorms right now, right? But we didn't. And the reason why they kidnapped those girls is because we didn't do anything. We didn't pay attention. And they want attention, right? And they know that attacking girls or women is going to get them attention. What are we going to do? Start a campaign, bring back our boys. Oh wait, they're dead. Never mind, right? The men, the people in Boko Haram, they're chivalrous. If those girls were boys, they wouldn't be getting education. They'd be dead. They wouldn't be sold into slavery with the hope of escape. They'd be dead.
Boko Haram has been fighting for Islamic rule in Nigeria since 2002. Its members have killed hundreds of people.
At least 69 dead, although some reports put the number at about 150 and scores more injured.
For that day when we shall lay down our burdens and study war no more. Finally, brethren, after a while, the battle will be over. For that day when we shall lay down our burden and study war no more. Finally, brethren, after a while,